Welcome back to Buddhist Beliefs, Practices, and Debates. We're in week 11 now with Buddhisms and violence. Please take a few deep breaths while looking at this screen. It is said that by meditating on the color orange, our brain releases more serotonin that can calm and relax us. It might be just a coincidence that many of the Buddhist robes are bright orange or dark orange, although they can come in brown and black. Is this a coincidence? What emotions do you associate with this image? I will argue in this lecture that Buddhisms are often associated with peace, whereas other religious traditions, like Islam, are associated with violence. The color saffron has been used in many different ways. In 2007, Burmese Buddhist monks marched in the streets, their alms bowls turned upside down, in public declaration that they no longer wanted the junta, the military government, to make any merit through giving to them. This public display of dissent was peaceful, in the vein of Gandhian Satyagraha, and as an example of how Buddhist preachings and practices are used for peacemaking. And this was called the Saffron Revolution. However, in Sri Lanka, from 1983 to 1989, there was the Saffron Army, which were Buddhist monks who were part of the Janata Vimukti Peramuna. And so we see from these two examples that the saffron robes embody both ends of the spectrum, that for peacemaking and that for violence. Because for the JVP monks, they were known to not only be involved in violence and riots, but some were implicated in assassinations and assassination attempts on the highest forms of government. Now, I did not begin my research on Buddhism and violence by looking at Buddhism and violence. I actually first got involved looking at activism. I was looking at the environmental monks in northern Thailand and the first fully ordained female monastic in Thailand in a form of what I saw was gender activism. The problem was that I realized in Thailand, social activism is not translated the same way in their language as it's done in the West. Gender activism and environmentalism are not looked upon favorably by many Thais. Instead, it's looked upon as intrusion and politicking. For them, activism should take place within oneself, not pushing onto other people. So I decided to halt on my work with these two groups, and then violence broke out in southern Thailand. Monks were seen with guns, and I became involved in trying to understand this phenomenon. The problem was that when trying to understand this phenomenon, I couldn't find much work on Buddhism in the study of religion and violence. There was cruel creeds and virtuous violence, religious violence across cultures and history, but nothing on Buddhism. Tear in the name of God, why religious militants kill, but these religious militants are only Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. Violent origins, ritual killing, and cultural formation. This is by phenomenal scholars, but none of this has to do with Buddhism. Pious passion by Martin Weisbrot. The passions are all looked upon with Christianity and Islam. Religion, Violence, Memory, and Place. A whole edited volume, but apparently there's no memory and place with Buddhism. Religion and Violence, Philosophical Perspectives from Kant to Derrida, but not one entry or page on Buddhism. Sacred Fury. This is a great overview of works having to do with religion and violence by Charles Selengott, but no work on Buddhism. When Religion Becomes Lethal by Charles Kimball. This again looks only at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So it was hard for me to make sense of the violence I was seeing in southern Thailand because Buddhism was absent from all these analyses of religion and violence. So I decided to then look at Buddhist sources to see what Buddhist sources had to say about violence. I looked at the Introduction to Buddhism by Peter Harvey, Teachings, History, and Practices, but there was nothing on Buddhist committing violence. Buddhism, introducing the Buddhist experience, but apparently there's no violence in the Buddhist experience. The Buddhist Handbook, the complete guide to Buddhist schools, teachings, practices, and history, but according to Snelling, there is no violence in all this. Buddhist thought, but there are no violent thoughts apparently in Buddhism. The Life of the Buddha, Life of Buddhism, an edited volume looking at Buddhism on the ground, lived religion, but not one entry having to do with conflict or violence. Critical Terms for a Study of Buddhism, great edited volume looking at chapters like sex, which we read for this course, and other things, but not one entry on violence. In fact, you can look at the Encyclopedia of Buddhism, over 1,000 pages long, over 20 entries having to do with peace and nonviolence, 0 entries related to violence. There are ramifications of leaving Buddhism out of the discourse on religion and violence. I mean, if you want to understand that phenomenon of religion and violence, you need to examine all examples to find commonalities. And if you want to offer an accurate portrayal of Buddhist lives and history, you'll need to talk about the less pleasant parts of that history, as well as the pleasant ones. Because when you leave out critical pieces in a puzzle, it creates false associations or problematic ones. For instance, let's consider right here suicide attacks. Who do we associate when we think of suicide attacks? Namely, which religion? If you're like me, you think of Islam. However, what about the kamikazes of World War II by the Japanese? The Red Army actually learned from these kamikazes that were fueled by Buddhist and Shinto ideas. And the Japanese Red Army was a socialist group that made use of these practices. On May 30th, 1972, Kozo Akamoto and 2 Red Army gunmen on behalf of the Lebanese engaged in the first contemporary suicide attack in the Middle East at the Lod Airport massacre in Tel Aviv, Israel. And so if we leave out Buddhism, we cannot understand the advent of modern day suicide attacks. In discussing Buddhism here in this lecture, I'm not trying to say that Buddhists are violent. My argument is that people are violent, and some of these people are Buddhists. Since I'm covering quite a bit, I'm going to divide up this lecture into 2 parts. The first will be to explain Buddhist methods of justifying violence, and in the second, to offer evidence of Buddhist-inspired violence. To begin looking at the role of violence or the justification for violence in Buddhist scriptures, we need to concern ourselves with Carl Schmitt, a 20th century German jurist, who pointed out that the exceptions to the laws are more important than the laws themselves. He talked about the state of emergency and the state of exception, because no matter how strong your laws are, if the emergency allows those laws to be frozen and changed, then the emergency contingency is more powerful than the laws themselves. We can think about this insight and play it into religion as well, since only after the 1700s did you really have a division between the state and religion. And in this vein, we should think about the power of the exception within religious laws. For example, the sixth commandment in Jewish and Christian and Muslim thought is not to not kill, but to not commit murder. Murder is not the same thing as killing, because murder is about a qualification, if it's legal or not. That's the exception. Now, in the study of Buddhism, I've identified 3 different exceptions that seem to allow violence to take place and be justified. The first of these is the stature of the person who commits the violence, whether it's a king, a soldier, or a butcher. By this, I mean that if you're a king, you need to instill law and instill order, and in this way implement capital punishment or corporal punishment, at least in accordance with the Buddhist scriptures. And soldiers need to fight as long as they keep a clear head. But butchers, because of killing all the animals, have to spend many rebirths in hell because of it. So your stature makes a big difference in terms of how you're treated when it comes to the violence you do. Now for soldiers, in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha explains that when a mercenary dies with the base thoughts of slaughtering and killing other people, he is reborn in either the hell or the animal realms, and thus soldiers are cautioned to avoid the base thoughts at the time of death and at the time of killing others, but not specifically to avoid the act of killing. This gets actually to the state of mind and the second state of exception, intentionality. The question is this accidental or deliberate? In one particular instance, an accidental death caused by pushing one's father can yield no offense, but the failed attempt to kill one's father by pushing him results in a grave offense. Yet a death caused by the deliberate intention to kill results in expulsion from the Sangha. And here we can see a link to euthanasia and abortion for monks, as we discuss in Buddhist ethics. The idea that if the intention is matched with the action, and that is killing for a monk, he's expelled. But if it's accidental, or if the person's insane, it's a different matter. The third exception is the stature of the victim. Is a person or being killed an animal, a supernatural being, or a human? For example, it's a less offense if you kill a crow as a monk. You only need to confess it and you're forgiven. And you can kill quite a few crows and keep on confessing. However, if you kill a supernatural being like a yakshas, a fearsome dryad, that's a grave offense. But if you kill a human, then you're expelled from the Sangha. And so we see here, again, the hierarchy of violence based upon the consequences. Animals are the least important, supernatural medium importance, human the most important. Yet, even within the realm of human issues, there are exceptions to this. The Buddhist monastic scholar Buddhaghosa writes about this in the Summa Gala Vilasini, in which he says, quote, "In the case of living creatures without moral virtues, such as animals, the act of killing is less blameworthy when the creature has a small body, and more blameworthy when the being has a large body. Why? Because the greater effort required in killing a being with a large body, and even when the effort is the same, the act of killing a large-bodied creature is still more blameworthy because of its greater physical substance. In the case of beings that possess moral virtues, such as human beings, the act of killing is less blameworthy when the being is of little virtue, and more blameworthy when the being is of great virtue. But when the body and virtue of creatures are equal, the act of killing is less blameworthy when the defilements and force of the effort are mild, and more blameworthy when they are powerful." And what we see happening right here is several things. First off, we see how, at least within Buddha-Gosha's doctrine, which is a Theravada doctrine, why Theravada countries like Thailand and Myanmar do not really eat a lot of beef because cows are large animals. And so instead they consume smaller animals like pig and chicken and seafood. But beyond that, though, we see that the moral virtues of a human determines the worthiness of them to be alive. If you recall from the last lecture, one of the 5 wicked sins you can do is cause the Buddha to bleed, because the Buddha is the most virtuous person. So causing him to bleed is the worst possible sin you can do. And killing an arhat, an awakened being, is also a wicked deed. But if that's the case, then the same is true on the opposite spectrum. Those with very little moral worth do not have much blameworthy if they're killed. And this gets us to what we discussed last lecture with the Chantikas. In the Chinese version of the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana Sutra, it's considered more harmful to kill an ant than a Chantika. And within this text, the Buddha explains that no negative karma accrues from killing them, saying, quote, "Just as no sinful karma will be engendered when one digs the ground, mows grass, fells trees, cuts corpses into pieces, and scolds and whips them." I didn't write this, by the way, I'm just reading the translation. The same is true when one kills a Chantika, for which deed also no sinful karma will arise. Because here, the Chantika has the least moral worth, and thus no sinful karma from killing them. Now, we've talked about these principles, so let's now look to some historical events that connect these principles to actual violence. So we're going to look here and see how the principles that justify violence in Buddhism are, 1, present in some of the important Buddhist scriptures, and 2, how this plays into actual historical events. Now in Sri Lanka, one of the most important and most sacred texts is the Mahavamsa. The Mahavamsa literally means the great branch, and Sinhalese Buddhists believe it's the mytho-history of their race as a people. I call it mytho-history because there isn't a lot of secondary outside research and evidence to support its narrative. Nonetheless, it's firmly and fully believed by many Sinhalese Buddhists, much like the Christian Bible. In one of the chapters of the Mahavamsa, the righteous Buddhist king Dutagami is fighting a war against the Tamil king Alara. He is trying to preserve the island of Lanka and keeping it Buddhist. And in this war, he has to wage a defense of Buddhism and affixes a relic onto his spear and leads his army to kill millions of Tamils. Now, upon uniting Lanka, King Dutagami feels remorse. He's visited by 8 arhats, 8 fully awakened beings, who explain to him this: "From this deed arises no hindrance in thy way to heaven. Only 1.5 human beings have been slain here by thee, O Lord of men. The one had come on to the 3 refuges." This would be the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The other take unto him the 5 precepts, which would be the Panchashila. Unbelievers and men of evil life were the rest, not more to be esteemed than beasts. But as for thee, thou wilt bring glory to the doctrine of the Buddha in manifold ways. Therefore cast away from thy heart, O ruler of men. So we see several things here. The first is that the idea of moral worth and the issue of killing. After killing millions of Tamils, the awakened beings tell the king that only 1.5 people actually died because only one of them was a Buddhist, because he had taken the 3 refuges. And only one of them was half a person, because although not a Buddhist, they practiced the 5 moral precepts in Buddhism. But the rest, because they're unbelievers, are no more than beasts. And recall that the penalty from killing a beast in Buddhism is much less, like a crow, than a human. Now, this mythical history, the Mahavamsa, was cited many times during the 26-year civil war taking place in Sri Lanka. The civil war began on 1983-2009. In this, on July 23rd, the Tamils in this organized group called the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam ambushed Sri Lankan military and ended up killing 15 of them. The Sri Lankan government decided to keep this quiet because they knew there were tensions mounting between the Sinhalese Buddhists and the Tamils, who were both Christian and Hindu. Unfortunately, keeping it quiet led to suspicions and gossip, and the following day, riots broke out across the country. Thousands of Tamils died, 10,000 homes destroyed, and there was a massive Tamil exodus leading out of the country, creating diasporas in places like Norway, Canada, and elsewhere. This was a very sad incident, but unfortunately, the Buddhist monks were involved with this and began to cite the Mahavamsa as a need to unite and keep the island unified. In 1995, President Chandrika Kumaratunga explained that she needed to engage in what she called the last resort. They needed to use violence. And this became an easy, powerful way in which we see Buddhist just war being implemented. 2 years later, the famous Sri Lankan Buddhist monk Piyadasi explained it as this. He said, quote, "You have to defend yourself. These are difficult questions. If someone goes to kill my mother, I'm going to stop him. So this could be a condition in which I am forced to kill." Now notice here, when Piyadasi says mother, he's using it as a metaphor, because Sri Lanka is the Buddhist motherland, and Sri Lankans see, or Sri Lankan Buddhists I should say, see Sri Lanka as the last refuge and vestige of true Buddhism in the world. And they need to defend this last refuge, this teardrop of a country next to India. All the while, they cite the Mahavamsa as a reason for this, as an example of what needed to be done and how it's righteous and just. Walpola Rahula, an author of important books on Buddhism in the United States, such as What the Buddha Taught and Heritage of the Bhikkhu, was the first Buddhist monk to hold a professorship in the United States as a professor of history and religion at Northwestern in Chicago. Walpola argued that the monks, the Sangha, and this is of course what he argues, is ready to lay down their lives to prevent the government from negotiating with the Tamil insurgents. He told the first Sri Lankan president to deal with this civil war, President Jayawardene, that he must militarily eradicate terrorism. And so while Rahula is talking in What the Buddha Taught about Buddhism being peaceful, we see here in his life and what he was doing on the ground a very different pretension and direction. If you recall, in Mahayana Buddhism, upaya is an important concept. Upaya means skill and means. And throughout Buddhist traditions, there's examples of what's called the Jatakas, the former rebirths of the Buddha. These Jatakas serve as moral templates explaining to Buddhists as they're young how to behave, what ethics to hold, and which contexts to apply them in. In one of the Jatakas, one of the stories of the Buddha's former rebirths, it's about him being a captain out at sea. This is called Murder with Skill and Means, the story of the compassionate ship's captain. In this story, he is the Captain Mahakarunika, Captain Great Compassion. And one night aboard the ship, he's visited by water deities. These deities instruct the captain, who again is the Buddha to be, that there is going to be a murderer on this ship. One person is going to kill all 500 people, including the captain. And the water deities tell the captain that not only is this terrible, but what makes this worse is that every single person on board the ship is a future Buddha. And recall again the value system in Buddhism, because the more virtuous and moral you are, the more disastrous killing them would be. So this would be a horrendous karmic result. The captain wakes up and thinks deeply about this, and finally comes to this sort of conclusion. There is no means to prevent this man from slaying the merchants and going to the great hells, but to kill him. And he, again, this is the Buddha to be, thought, if I were to report this to the merchants, they would kill and slay him with angry thoughts, and all go to great hells themselves. Again, remember, intention. And he thought, if I were to kill this person, I would likewise burn in the great hells for 100,000 eons because of it. Yet I can bear to experience the pains of the great hells, so this person not slay these 500 merchants and develop so much evil karma. I will kill this person myself. So here we see again the idea of intentionality. The Buddha, to be the captain, thinks that because the murderer chooses to kill these people, it's going to be horrendous, and the karmic results would be terrible too. And if you tell the merchants, they would kill this man with terrible thoughts. So he would be compassionate and kill the man himself to avoid all these karmic results. This would be an example of what's called compassionate violence in Buddhism. We see this notion of compassionate violence play out during the Russo-Japanese War and Japanese imperialism during World War II, particularly through the acts of D.T. Suzuki and his mentor, Soen Shaku. If you recall, D.T. Suzuki and Soen Shaku were the people most involved in spreading Buddhism to the United States during the Parliament of World Religions Conference in Chicago in 1893. Now, D.T. Suzuki has been the author of many books, just like Walpole Russell was. And among them in the United States, he has written on an introduction to Zen Buddhism, with a foreword by Carl Jung, and outlines of Mahayana Buddhism, and is held in high regard by American Buddhists. Suzuki explained during the Russo-Japanese War that, quote, religions need to support unconditionally Japan's efforts to punish heathen countries. Suzuki means by this that religions plural because Japanese Buddhism and Japanese Shintoism need to support Japanese efforts to punish heathen countries like Russia. His mentor, Soen, explained it as such. In the present hostilities in which Japan has entered with great reluctance, she pursues no egotistic purpose, but seeks the subjugation of evils, hostile civilization, peace, enlightenment. And here we see, of course, the idea of compassion, compassionate violence. Because whether it's Japan going into Russia, where there's non-Buddhists, or Korea and China, where their Buddhists are different than the Japanese Buddhists, the Japanese Buddhists think that they have true Buddhism and that they're bringing peace to these people, that they're being compassionate. Because while these people may die, in the end, there is no self. There's an anatman. And so they'll be reborn in lands in which there is true Buddhism and they can become awakened. At one point, Tolstoy writes to Soen Shaku and implores him to write to both Russia and Japan together to urge them to cease firing. And Soen Shaku writes back to Tolstoy and explains this. Even though the Buddha forbade the taking of life, he also taught that until all sentient beings are united together through the exercise of infinite compassion, there will never be peace. Therefore, as a means of bringing into harmony those things which are incompatible, killing and war are necessary. And so we see here not only an example of Buddhist just war theory, that war is necessary, but how it's compassionate violence in order to bring about sentient beings being awakened throughout the world. This brings up the notion of shunyata, emptiness, which we covered earlier on in our lectures. Shunyata means emptiness. And here, Soen Shaku explains that because soldiers and people are empty of any true nature, that killing is not really that bad. That's actually compassionate to kill. And it's necessary to do so in order to fulfill the ultimate Buddhist desire, which is awakening all people. And this is within a Mahayana Buddhist template. And with the Sri Lankan example, a Theravada Buddhist template. Now we've seen how defense of Buddhism can necessitate violence and how we can use compassion as a means of justifying violence in Buddhism, but there's also a sense of what's called reciprocal violence. And this is evident in the blue-green frog Jataka, another one of those stories of the Buddha's former rebirths. In the story, the Buddha is a blue-green frog, and he sees that many fish are trapped in a net, and a snake falls into the trap too. The snake tries to get out of the trap and asks for help. And the frog answers, if you eat fish which gets into your lair, the fish eat you when you get into theirs. And having pronounced his opinion, the fish seize upon the snake's weakness and tear him apart. And so here, the Buddha, in his former rebirth, condones violence due to the context of reciprocity. Because the snake has killed fish before when it gets into his lair, it's okay for fish to attack snakes when they get into their lair. And just reviewed again, we see a just war ideology present in Buddhism. We've learned now that just war theory is not just an Abrahamic notion, but also ones that exist in other religions. In Sri Lanka, true Buddhism needs to be preserved, and this is why they have to fight the 26-year civil war. In Japan, they have preserved true Buddhism in Asia, and this leads to the Russo-Japanese War and World War II. But we also learned something else. A common methodology of dehumanization. Oftentimes with violence, this is a means of making violence okay by making the person no longer seem human, whether it's found in the Ichantikas, those people who can never become awakened, or recall in Sri Lanka how only 1.5 people died because the rest are just merely beasts because they're not Buddhists or they don't follow the Buddhist precepts. And in Japan, it's probably the most powerful example of dehumanization because in the end, there are no humans. Everyone's empty of any true nature, so there is no violence to commit. So going back to my investigation of violence in southern Thailand, I found that Buddhist monks engaging in violence is not an exception to the rule or a unique situation, but rather there's a long history of this throughout Asia. Whether you have it in China with Buddhist-inspired revolts, fighting against supposedly the rebirth of Mara, the embodiment of temptation, or the coming of the new Buddha, who would be Maitreya. You see soldier monk revolts in Tibet, the assassination of a Tibetan king, Langdara, because he has the the impudence to not support Buddhism and wants to instead support the indigenous religion of Tibet instead. And to this day, Tibetans celebrate the killing of this king and their dance. But it's throughout Asia, Japan, the Wei Dynasty, Korea, the Warring State period in Japan, and Laos, in Russia, and Korea, and Japan, and Sri Lanka, and even in Myanmar, where we see in recent years how the Burmese Buddhist monks have led massive riots against the Rohingya, in which over 700,000 have had to flee the country, and homes have been destroyed, and rapes and killings have taken place throughout villages. I hope that while disturbing, this lecture gives you a sense of the relationship Buddhism has to violence, how Buddhism can be used to justify violence, and how this has been used in actual historical cases for violence. Please make sure to answer the questions posted on Blackboard for the weekend discussion thread for week 11. Now, do not forget to respond to at least 2 of your classmates' answers as well, because these answers and responses are all due before Friday at 5 p.m. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me at mjerryson@gmail.com. I look forward to reading your posts.